Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this first mini course that Spirit Alive is offering this year. For those of you who are new to our program, Spirit Alive is a ministry of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, and my name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi, and I am the director of the program. So on behalf of the Sisters of St. Joseph, I welcome all of you this evening, if you're here tonight, and those of you who will be listening to the recording. Before I introduce our distinguished guest, a few announcements. Every class is recorded. So if you miss one, or if you would like to listen to it again, you can find the recording on the Spirit Alive YouTube channel. But it usually takes about 72 hours before it's edited and posted on the YouTube channel. So don't expect to hear it again tomorrow morning. You have to wait a couple of days. If you need closed captioning, please use the CC button. I think on an iPad, it's in the top. On a computer, it's in the bottom. While Professor Shapiro is presenting tonight, all of your videos will be off and your speakers will be off. If he wants to ask a question, you'd like to reply or make a comment during the presentation, please use the chat feature on your computer. At the end of the presentation, when we move into the Q&A period, we are going to turn your mics on and your videos on so that everybody can see everybody. And then at that point, use your raise your hand icon so that you can be acknowledged. Our programming is free of charge. If you're here with us tonight for the first time, you should know the Sisters of St. Joseph subsidize this program, but we really do rely on your donations. So any donation of any amount, I'd be most welcome to have it. Also, just so you know, our presenter is an observant Jew. So please note that on Thursday, October 2nd, in observance of Yom Kippur, we will skip class and return on October 9th. So we'll have 2 September classes, skip October 2nd, and then start on the 9th and I guess the 16th, and then I guess it's the 23rd after that. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce your instructor, Dr. Joshua Shapiro. After completing his undergraduate degree at Columbia University, Joshua attained a master's in theological studies from Harvard Divinity School, specializing in Buddhist studies. Joshua then completed a PhD in the study of religion in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. Dr. Shapiro has held a number of teaching positions, but since 2009, he is a senior lecturer in the theology department at Fordham University, where he teaches classes in Buddhism, Hinduism, and both Chinese and Japanese religions. He is an award-winning scholar and an award-winning teacher, and has a lengthy record of publications in scholarly journals. Joshua is married with a precocious 7-year-old daughter who may unexpectedly pop up on your screen if she wants to join Dad for the presentation. So we welcome you, Joshua, and we're honored that you have carved out time to be with us, to enlighten us, and to share your knowledge. So thank you very much, and take it away.
So thank you, Sister Maria, for the really kind introduction. And in particular for inviting me. This is a really nice honor and a fun treat for me to be able to spend these weeks with you, both one version of this presentation in the fall, and then if anyone's interested, which might be a bit presumptuous before we get into the material, but if anyone's interested, we'll expand on some of these concepts in the spring. And also thank you to Matthew and all of the behind the scene folks, as well as all the support from the Sisters of St. Joseph and the like. This is going to be a lot of fun for me. As I've been teaching for years in the college classroom, I do my very best to make things interactive, which feels a little bit different on Zoom, as you all know, or even if you're watching eventually a recording on YouTube. So I'll do my best to ask some questions. Whether or not you're taking notes or not isn't really the point, but rather just to generate examples as I bring up relevant opportunities for thought exercises and the like. The extent that you're willing to participate in that, even if watching the video, I think that will lead to kind of better learning outcomes, which sounds a bit formal, but also more importantly, it'll just be a little bit more fun. So anyone who's here live, please feel free to fill up the chat. I won't always be able to respond to what's in the chat, but I'll do my best to at least peek. And then we'll have open conversation, and then we can see how this goes from week to week. So I'm going to jump right in here with the beginning of the presentation. And since we're on Zoom, I think it'll be helpful to, excuse me, actually, it'll be helpful to use some slides. So let me just properly share here. Yeah, see how this works. Oh, this is the wrong. Hold on. All right, so hopefully folks can see this slide here with Shakyamuni Buddha's name, right, on the problem of suffering. And someone can raise their hand or let me know if you're not seeing the right slide. The basic idea for today's program is to give a really broad introduction to the remarkably rich and diverse tradition of Buddhism. We'll do it relatively quickly, but I want to make it somewhat fun. So we'll look at a couple images in today's session. And then we'll come back to some of these introductory notes next week, next Thursday, with a couple short video clips. The idea here being is a reminder that even though the focus of our discussions will be on the path towards spiritual awakening, which is going to be conceptual in that we're having kind of an intellectual conversation, the reminder is that, Buddhists are real human beings who have themselves many diverse ideas and practices, who themselves have innovated a good amount in the last 2,500 years. And so when we have moments to remind ourselves about Buddhism being a living tradition with real human beings and their own ideas, we'll do so. Even though the focus on this class, which I think will work pretty well, is to try to take as seriously as humanly possible some of the proposals that are at the heart of a variety of Buddhist practice. And for better for worse for you all, the first real proposal that we need to consider this week, at least in some detail, is, as you can see from this slide, the problem of suffering. So we'll introduce this, and then we'll slowly but surely build on some layers of the ways that Buddhists think about the problem of suffering, some of which will be really familiar. I'm hoping some of which will not be all that familiar to many of you. And then we'll build on this next week, in fact, before getting to some of the so-called solutions. So here, to share again, just a very brief document. This leaves some of the dates for our sessions. But more importantly, this is a broad overview of what our 5 sessions will look like. So today, we're going to do a couple different things, but focus primarily on suffering and really sufferings in the plural. Next week, we're going to talk about karma, which is a word I'm sure everyone has heard, but is sometimes misunderstood. Karma, in a way, holds both the secret to understanding why suffering is such a challenging problem to address, why so many facets of our human suffering actually aren't even in our awareness, meaning in our active recognition or realization. Rather, behind the scenes, there are all sorts of shifts of certain conditions that set up what feels like the inevitability of living a life filled with suffering. So a lot of the answers to this have to do with karma. And then the last big piece that's going to explain suffering is this question of self, no self, and the attachment to self. So I'm imagining, again, even with very little introduction to Buddhism, some of these broad themes might be familiar to you. But once we get into the details, I'm pretty confident that we will be able to illuminate some new, exciting ideas. And then, in fact, once we've gotten a really good hold on the problem or the problems plural, we're going to have a much better understanding of both the ambition of and also the practicality of some of the solutions. So we'll do a short session on meditation. Of course, we could have classes upon classes on different Buddhist strategies of meditation, but we'll explain some basic principles. And then we'll talk about how, at least in early Buddhist traditions, in what we're calling in this semester or in this set of sessions in the fall, the gradual path, we'll see how important renunciation and monasticism, becoming a monk or nun, is in the logic of the path. And then starting in the spring, if you're still with me or you want to jump in there, We'll see some non-monastic options as well. All right, so that's plenty of introduction. If already you have any questions, I may or may not be able to address them in Zoom. Feel free to start filling up the chat. That's also nice for me in a selfish way because I know folks are really out there listening and paying attention. All right, but let's dive in here with our briefest of brief introductions to the tradition. So, the simplest way of thinking about Buddhism as a religion on Earth, at least in our aeon or in our time, is to think back to the life of Shakyamuni Buddha. This is actually a title given to him by his disciples. Buddha means someone who woke up, which, if you think about it, means that the rest of us here, literally, hopefully not, but figuratively, certainly, are actually all asleep. So, waking up means waking up to the realities of life, including the reality of suffering. So this could be a real challenge today, at least in an hour or so, 45 minutes, considering what it might mean to begin to wake up to our own suffering, which I assume sounds outrageous. Nobody needs to be told that life has elements of suffering in it. But hopefully you'll get a taste of why this is a process of awakening. Shakyamuni is also a title. Muni means the sage, the wise person of the Shakya or the Sakya clan. So the story goes that he was a prince who lived kind of a life of means and of pleasures, even of indulgence. He even, before things change quickly, gets married and has a child, a son named Rahul. And he finds that there's no real satisfaction in this life of pleasures, both material pleasures, but also even the interpersonal pleasures and the pleasures of having responsibilities within his family. None of this satisfies him in a sense, but also he starts to recognize some of the sufferings we're going to be talking about today. And so therefore he essentially runs away. He runs away from his wife, child, and his father, which I should say causes some anxiety in later Buddhist communities about the morality of this decision. But essentially, from the Buddhist tradition, you'll understand why this is so significant, because he essentially, after wandering around, checking out people's teachings for maybe 7, 8 years, finding some new friends that he's going to meditate with, realizing their style of meditation isn't going to cut it, he ends up emaciated, tired, gets a nice snack from a young woman or a young girl who gives him some rice gruel, basically what we now consider to be like hot cereal or oatmeal. It helps energize him. He sits under a tree until he figures it all out. What does he figure out? Well, we're going to start talking a little bit about this. So when does this life actually occur? And again, scholars think that even if some of these stories, didactic stories about his life, may be later accretions, everyone seems to agree this is a real human being. There's a lot of debate both within and outside of Buddhist communities about when Shakyamuni Buddha might have lived. But for our purpose, it's good enough to say he lived around the 5th century before the Common Era. Okay. Some scholars say maybe 100 years later. In Southeast Asia, they think maybe 100 years earlier. But for our purposes, about 2,500 years ago. And he's born in a kingdom, grows up in a kingdom that's now part of Nepal. Of course, the kingdom of Nepal did not yet exist. And he mostly wandered around what's modern day Varanasi, broadly speaking, and the Ganges River area in central and northern India. And he wanders around once he figures things out for about 45 years. But that's only the beginning of the story, because as we'll see, and I hope you'll start to understand why, people were really captivated with his ideas, not only with his understanding of why life is so challenging and unsatisfying, but also the solutions he offers. And so he starts to very quickly gain followers. And a few centuries after his death, so even still a few couple hundred years now before the beginning of the Common Era or even before Jesus, right? You have the spread of Buddhist teachings in Buddhist communities all the way throughout the South Asian Peninsula to Sri Lanka. So Buddhism makes it there pretty quickly. Part of the reason to show this image is to just recognize the vast influence of Buddhist ideas, including a lot of the ideas we're going to be talking about today and over the coming weeks, but also to begin to kind of humble ourselves, right? Myself included in giving this presentation, to recognize how much cultural diversity is evident in real Buddhist communities, not to mention how much kind of temporal change has happened. I mean, if it's been 2,500 years since the life of the Buddha and Buddhism is spread to all of these places, which I'll enumerate in a minute, you can realize or you can imagine, let's say, the kind of richness of different cultural ideas, interpretations, innovations, techniques, artistic forms, literary forms, poetic forms, dance forms, theatrical forms, rituals, festivals, and the like. So again, this isn't a class about global Buddhism, but I thought it'd be good to remind ourselves about this at the beginning of the class. So you can see here, Buddhism spreads quite quickly to Sri Lanka. Then over the next, let's say, 1,000 years, by around 500 of the Common Era, you start to have Buddhist practices and even Buddhist communities in Southeast Asia. Buddhism spreads to all these places where there aren't that many Buddhists anymore, for example, in Indonesia, right? But there was a lot of practice in this region for centuries. Also in what's sometimes called Central Asia, and to even pieces that we sometimes associate with the Middle East, there are large Buddhist communities. Okay, even there are, though there no longer really exist in Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? And then because of the famous Silk Route, which I'm sure many people have heard of, by around the first century of the Common Era, kind of remarkably, all of these Buddhist ideas ship all the way east here to China, where the capitals were back then, around here, from China to Korea to Japan. And then in a third transmission or in a third spread, if the first spread kind of goes south here and east, if the second spread goes along the Silk Route up kind of this via this northern route, you also have the spread around 1200 years after the life of the Buddha, let's say, in the 8th century primarily, you have Buddhism spreading here to the Tibetan cultural region, which might sound crazy because this looks really close on the map, which it is. But of course, the Himalayan mountains are here, which probably prevented some of these ideas from reaching the relatively smaller communities by population, but as we'll see, culturally really significant communities in Tibet and various Himalayan cultures, what's modern day Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, which is now part of India and the like. So in any event, this is a lot of words to describe the basic idea, which is that Buddhist ideas and practices are just incredibly popular, even before colonialism and the spread of Buddhism throughout the rest of the world, right? You can see how many different places Buddhist ideas went, right? And then imagine a little bit of the different forms that came with it. So to make this slightly more fun before we get to the ideas, I thought I would show you some pictures. So thank you in advance for playing along here. Hold on. All right, so hopefully you can see these images. Okay. Again, part of the idea here is just to have a little bit of fun, to see like beautiful pieces of art from the Buddhist world, but also to get a kind of a tiny taste, one exemplification of the diversity of Buddhist practice, just simply evident in the different ways that the Buddha is represented. So believe it or not, this is an image of Buddha, though of course it's not an image of a human being. Here you have devotees or followers. It's possible that these are goddesses of some sort or semi-divine figures, but in any event, wherever these folks are, they are worshiping Buddha. They're worshiping Shakyamuni Buddha, but that seems strange because you don't see anyone there. And in fact, in many early representations of Buddha, of this awakened being and this teacher, he doesn't even appear. So this is a representation that's from maybe a couple of centuries before the Common Era. And folks here are worshiping the representation of the Buddha as a wheel. So why on earth would the Buddha be represented as a wheel in this stunning carving here that was part of a kind of a ritual or pilgrimage site? Well, as we'll see, some of the teachings that we're going to get to today are called the turning of the wheel. In fact, the first great turning of the wheel, which very quickly just becomes a symbolic representative of Buddha's teachings. And it seems, although scholars don't exactly know, that there's a real emphasis after the time of the Buddha's death to focus on the ongoing life of his teachings rather than on the human being himself. Now, the extent to which Buddha was a god or godlike, this is actually a much more complicated question, right? Without being too presumptuous, I'm imagining this is the kind of theological question a lot of people on here might be curious about. So if we want to talk about God and gods in the Buddhist tradition, eventually I'm happy to get there. But even we see here, at the very least, this kind of concern to focus on Buddhist teachings. Why is Buddhist teachings considered to be a wheel? Well, it's symbolic of the Buddha conquering the world, comparable to what's called a wheel-turning king, which is a term for a great warrior king who would conquer territory by taking out his war chariot. But obviously, the Buddha doesn't go to war. Maybe that's not obvious, but he doesn't. But rather, what does he conquer? He conquers misunderstanding, ignorance, desire, and as we'll see today, suffering. So in a way, it's a really different model of thinking about what a great divine, perhaps, but certainly sovereign hero looks like, and an emphasis on the Buddha as the purveyor of great world-changing teachings. So in any event, early representation of the Buddha. But this idea of Buddha as simply a purveyor of teachings, right? At some point, I wouldn't say falls away, but becomes less popular, right? And so here we have a much, much later representation of the Buddha in a Pure Land, which is a perfect place to learn Buddhism. Much better, I think, than in a course on Zoom, although again, we're doing our best. But this is a divine realm, right? With all sorts of both human but also divine visitors to this realm listening to the Buddha teach. And here you have the representation. Hopefully the zooming in here is working. You can see how beautiful this representation is on this Thangka painting, which comes from Tibet. This painting's maybe from the 1700s. Okay, so here we have a very different cultural representation of Buddha, again, offering teachings. All right, so that's our first image here. Okay, see what happens here. Great. Okay, here's another image. This is from a much more recent sculpture of Buddha. It's actually a related Buddha. It's not technically Shakyamuni Buddha. That's something we might talk about next spring if we get there. But the idea here is that there are other great models who look a lot like and act like Shakyamuni Buddha who are available for teaching. This one is called Amida. He's associated with the Western region of the universe, really. But again, somewhat similar. And this is a massive, 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 massive construction in Japan. So here we have a massive Japanese Buddha. You can see stylistically quite different, even if you recognize some of the features of the Buddha. And again, significant to mention, Buddhas aren't simply represented for artistic edification, though they're beautiful, but also because they serve ritual purposes. And to simplify a much more complicated story here, you might visit on a vacation or on a Sunday or during a holiday, this particular major statue in Japan or others like it. And simply by attending to the Buddha, offering prayers, and also walking around what's called circumambulating representations of the Buddha, you can generate positive merit. Why would you generate positive merit? We're going to have to talk about that next week. Okay, so here's another representation of Buddha to go with our prior two. Here you have a huge Buddha that was actually completed within the last few decades in Thailand. So notice the difference in style, which points to the kind of cultural diversity of Buddha, but also the long-standing influence of this heroic figure. So really well beyond life size, right? We've come a long way in a sense from the idea of the Buddha as a human being who's primarily significant because of his teachings to this literally supersized image of the greater than life divine figure who's also available to help us here in this example of Thailand. And you here see a visitor. I can't tell if this human being is taking a picture, but also very possibly praying or making an offering or asking for something in return. Okay, so here we have another Buddha, right? And then finally, I just closed out for the New York City crowd. If anyone is local, I know we're joining from all around the world, different cultural representations, old beautiful statues that we have here in New York City at the Metropolitan Museum. Okay. And again, in these images, you can just see the kind of grand historical style of representations of the Buddha that you can see some familiarities in these representations. This isn't an art class, so I'm not going to lecture about it, but I'm sure you can even pick up on a few. You can note some down and stick them in the chat if you so like. But also the difference. I mean, the real significant different ways that people not only represent, but then also imagine what it even means to be Shakyamuni Buddha. What does it even mean to be an awakened being? Okay, and here are 6 images for us to get started with. All right, so we're going to get into some ideas in just a second. If anyone has any questions or surprises or responses, again, I don't mean to keep on heckling you like this, and I do appreciate you taking the time to listen here. But if you're curious, would like to, I would love to see messages or questions in the chat. Please do feel free. And I'm going to start asking you for specific examples in just a second. All right, so let's start the kind of content here of the class. Oops. All right, so Where are we going to start? We're going to speak about actually Shakyamuni Buddha's first sermon. The story here is that once he wakes up, he's actually reluctant to wakes up, meaning once he recognizes the reality of suffering and the path to overcoming suffering, which is, I assume, the reason why we're here talking, because people are curious about some of his answers. Once he wakes up, he's actually quite reluctant. He doesn't think that people will take him seriously or be able to follow him. But eventually, from the help of some gods who kind of twist his arm metaphorically, he begins to talk. And the first group of people he talks to are five old friends of his that he used to be basically in a meditation club with. They used to engage in meditation together, but he didn't really like their approach, which involved a lot of self-denial. They essentially starved themselves kind of through extreme ascetic practices, hoping that this would allow them to escape from the negative experiences of life. He said that's not going to cut it, primarily because there is an absence of insight, an absence of recognition, an absence of understanding, really an absence of perception of reality as such, right? So to simplify a more complicated story, his argument is that we can't run away from life to understand how suffering functions. Rather, we both need to discipline ourselves to look carefully and not to look away from the problems, but also to generate insight into them. And so what he does is, I wouldn't say he's chastising, although in a sense you might read his first sermon as teasing these old friends of his for the mistakes they've made. But then very quickly he positively gives them a full path to liberation in even a few pages. Okay. And there he lays out the fundamental problem of suffering that we're going to talk about. So many people, I'm sure, have heard of the Four Noble Truths. In a way, they are foundational teachings of the Buddha, right? Whether literally or figuratively, embodied by the fact that the name for these teachings of the Four Noble Truths is the turning of the wheel that I was mentioning before. The point being, this is supposed to be a miraculously significant moment in our aeon in the world, that someone who is as awake as the Buddha woke up and then gave us the gift of teachings by turning this wheel of teaching that was going to, again, conquer the world, quite literally. And what are they about? They're about these four truths, which I'm going to lay out in a second. And then we're going to focus on the first one, which is suffering. Okay. So um, the first truth is the problem of suffering. All right. So just for the sake of having something to hold on to, kind of a structure here, I'm going to summarize these four truths, which maybe you've heard. And then we're going to go pretty slowly for the remaining half an hour. Okay, so the first problem is the problem of suffering. And as you'll see when we explain different forms of that suffering or different explanations of that suffering, which, by the way, is sometimes translated as dissatisfaction or unsatisfactoriness, which isn't particularly poetic. But the reason sometimes people, especially in technical literature, refer to it that way, and here it's just a translation choice of the same Sanskrit term of dukkha. The reason sometimes people emphasize dissatisfactoriness is because this problem of change, excuse me, this problem of suffering, which I'm going to show you in a minute, is really a problem of change, instability, impermanence. Um, Incorporates everything from slight dissatisfaction, right? You were really looking forward to dinner and it went too quickly. We were really looking forward to dinner, but then it turned out that some of the ingredients weren't as fresh as you'd hoped, right? So again, not the most major problems in our lives, right? But they do bring a certain lack of satisfaction to them, to much more dramatic experiences of dissatisfactoriness. So you can think of your own examples here. Here, by the way, it would be helpful for you to start taking notes, not so much because we're going to have a quiz. I don't mean it that way at all, but rather just to say, if you can come up with a couple examples of both like really minor irritations or moments of dissatisfaction, even within the last 24 hours of your life. And then you might want to think about, without dwelling, I hope for our purposes, on some major moments of either dissatisfaction or loss. I mean, all the heavy things that we all know are a part of human life. That would be helpful. The reason is if we don't think about those examples, and in a way, this is a very Buddhist tradition to function this way. If we don't take seriously the examples, then we're not really learning, meaning we're not taking them sufficiently seriously, right? If we can't kind of push up against the descriptions we're going to find with our own experience. So you can start that process right now if you're ready. But in any event, in summary, suffering, as we will see, is also really a recognition of change and the fact that nothing is satisfying, certainly not for any length of time in a lasting way. in a world of change. It's actually a really ambitious claim. We're going to look at it. Now, the bad news is you can't do anything about this. This is reality. It's one of the aspects of reality, but a change woke up to. But actually, the second truth, which sounds like it's going to be even worse, and we'll have to spend some time here, is great news. Ironically. Why? Because actually human beings makes things worse, as you can see. The cause of suffering isn't the very nature of the presence of suffering as is, or those conditions of change which prevent things from ever being as satisfying as we want them to be. But actually, what really gets us into trouble are how our responses make things worse. First, by judging things to be either positive or negative or not worth our time, neutral, but then also the quick emotional responses that build on those judgments. I want it. I don't like it, right? I'm jealous of that. I hate that. We'll get into some of these details. So why on earth would I suggest this is good news? You can take down a note or even stick it in the chat if you have some ideas. Why is it good news that we make things worse? Well, the simple story, which I don't think any of you will be convinced of until we get into the details. But the simple story is that if there's a cause where we make things worse, we can cut it out. See how this goes? It is going to be possible to eliminate number two, even if we can't eliminate number one the way we would think we should. So, in fact, the very fact of the recognition of the cause of suffering, though it's something that we need to eliminate, or really a series of habits to eliminate, is a more accurate way of describing it. And by the way, these are deep, deep, deep-seated habits, right? So if you think it's hard to stop biting your nails if you're a nail biter, or using, I don't know, cursing at inopportune moments, or whatever it might be, right? We all have our tics, or one person rubs their nose, the other one plays with their hair, whatever it might be, right? Someone twiddles their thumbs. If you think habits like that are tricky, what about the habits we don't even recognize we have? And what if some of those habits are perceptual? Meaning, what if our very way of seeing the world and the assumptions we make about how the world works and what's real in the world are themselves habits that cause us to respond and make things worse? So hopefully we're starting to get a taste of how ambitious this is. By the way, as a preview, all of next week about karma is going to be about how we produce our own reality through problematic habitual activities. This is heavy, but really fascinating. And again, eventually we will get to, according to the Buddha, historically, as we find in all of these old scriptures or sermons or speeches that he offers, sometimes they're called discourses. We will find that the Buddha, according to these texts, and certainly communities that followed him, think actually we can do something about this, so much so that we can end our experience of suffering. That doesn't mean we end the world of change exactly, but we can end the world of suffering. The simple story is by eliminating the cause, which are these misconceptions and the habits built upon them, right? But as I always joke in class, the path is complicated and tricky. Why? Right? Again, you can put things into the chat if you like. Think of examples of your own life if you like, for fun. Share them with your friends if you're brave enough. But you might think about like any time in your life where you've adopted a New Year's resolution approach to improving things, right? Whether it's actually on New Year's or during a religious festival or a moment of great change in your life or in response to a tragedy. Right? I'm not belittling any of these dramatic moments in our lives, right? I think we've all had some kind of them. But how difficult it is to have those kinds of transformations stick. And I'm sure you guys have other examples, right? Where in fact something really did move for you. In many cases, when we just recognize a problem, even if we're convinced about something politically or spiritually or religiously or otherwise, I don't know, right? Financially, right? Changing our habits and changing the way we understand that phenomena is not so easy. A transformation of, let's say, an addiction or a behavior within a relationship, especially as we all know in our familial relationships, right? I think about this all the time. Going to see my family, I'm very lucky that my parents are alive, right? And able to spend time with them. And yet, the moment I set set a step into my childhood home, which I'm really lucky to be able to visit outside in the Boston area in the suburbs, right? It's as if those old habits reemerge. It's almost like the habits are living in my kitchen, in my bedroom, in the living room. And, I'm a grown up, as I'm sure you all are, right? I know to behave more or less respectfully, right? And I still care about my parents. But sometimes the mental habits arise when I'm there, right? You kind of start behaving almost like a teenager. And if not a teenager, then like a grumpy 20-year-old. Or, you can think of your own examples. Maybe I'm the crazy person in this group and you don't have this problem. But I'm sure that there's other comparable situations where we are really ingrained in our habitual responses to things, not because we have a certain philosophy of life, right? I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, right? Believe in democracy, I'm a communist, I'm a socialist, I'm Catholic, I'm Protestant. I don't mean like in those terms, right? I mean actually in our momentary habitual way of seeing the world. I'm someone who focuses on this. I'm someone who focuses on this. I get irritated when this happens. I respond in this way. In any event, we'll try to generate examples of this. But what's the whole point of this kind of sidebar about our habits and the challenge of January 1st, New Year's resolution approaches to life? Well, the fact is they don't stick, right? And that's why you need a path. So the complicated thing for a professor of Buddhism, but more importantly for anyone learning about Buddhism, is how many different versions of the path have emerged realistically over the course of 2,500 years in different cultures, speaking different languages, with different needs, and so on. So, in fact, the actual application of the path to end suffering, which means ending the causes where we make things worse in our responses to change, these actual strategies are really numerous, but also beautiful. So, part of what we're going to do in the coming weeks and then into the spring, if you're so interested, is just look at some really, really fascinating versions of the path to eliminating suffering. That's the project. Okay, so if people have any questions, you can start putting them in. I appreciate this mention about Stoicism. That's not my expertise. I don't think there's been any explicit proof of the kind of cross-cultural influence of one tradition to another, but plenty of people have been wondering and talking about this because it's very clear that images from Buddhist traditions make their way into the broader, like Alexandrian Greek world, right? So it's quite clear that there must have been some kind of communication here. But at least as far as I know, into 2025, no one has a convincing story about how this might have gone. But wonderful question. And maybe we can talk about this more if there are kind of Stoic philosophers here in the group later on. All right, so please consider adding some questions here. I'm going to try to get through a little bit more before we open things up at 8 o'clock. So thank you for your patience for that. All right, so let's talk about suffering. One way of dividing up sufferings, and this is just one way, this is called the three sufferings. It's an early teaching of the Buddha, but it fits in with other teachings where he enumerates many other different forms of suffering. So many people they've taken a Buddhism 101 class or watched a short film about the life of the Buddha, have heard of birth, old age, sickness, and death. That's another enumeration of the ever presence of suffering in our lives. The point here is not that can be only one list, but rather these are different strategies for recognizing what? The ever presence of dissatisfaction. So the first one is pretty straightforward. It's called the suffering of suffering. And here you see I note this is what we judge to be bad, right? Which just means this is a really broad category. This is where you get mosquito bites, you get spending time with people who frustrate you, which by the way is in one of the early discourses. I always joke about that, but like being stuck in the back seat, right, with your sibling when you're a kid on a long drive, that's suffering. The Buddha all, minus the part about the Thanksgiving in a car, Buddha basically laid this out 2,500 years ago. So this isn't news that it's frustrating to spend time with people that we judge to be annoying, even momentarily, right? To also really dramatic things, something like a loss, right? A loss is going to fit into multiple categories, death, but here just simply the unpleasant feeling, right? The overcoming sadness and the way that we instinctively judge sadness to be bad. Again, I'm sure this is a spiritually sophisticated crowd. No one is saying that there can't be some meaningful learning or loss could bring you together or lead you to appreciate. No one is making an argument that these experiences of human experiences are themselves qualitatively a problem, but rather to recognize the honest aspect of our psychology, which is just simply to react negatively to experiences, little ones, big ones. Okay, so This is probably not worth spending time on insofar as everyone knows that life is filled with these. The key thing to recognize is we just can't control when they pop up. Next time, we'll have some theories of why that is, right? In a way, the suffering of suffering is already an example of change. So you can think of like a mild discomfort you have. Again, put it in the chat if you want to share, or just think of your own examples. And why is that mild discomfort, right? I don't really like my chair, right? I'm feeling like it's a little humid in this office I'm in. Or, just keep on having a mosquito itch, right? These are all, in a way, manifestations of the frustration of the change of comfort, pleasant situations, or even neutral situations, right? I mean, we're all reasonable human beings. None of us expect the world at every moment, right? Not all expecting constant bliss or pleasure or spiritual satisfaction or whatever it might be, religious belonging, right? Even wonderful big things like this, we're reasonable. We're not expecting that 24 hours a day. But still, we get frustrated because even basic comforts don't last. All right. But things are worse, a lot worse. Why? Because it's even the good things that cause suffering. And this is something I think we really need to talk about for a few minutes, and I hope you can consider over the coming week. Right? Again, this isn't because the Buddha judges pleasant experiences or satisfying experiences, right? Or even meaningful experiences. Like, let's say you judge positively your artistic practices, or your athletics, or your social group, or you love playing cards with friends, or having long conversations, or going for walks, or prayer, or whatever it might be, right? The point is not that these are bad or secretly sinful. None of that language appears here. It's just rather built into the experience of judging something as positive is the inevitability of suffering and dissatisfaction. This is really heavy if we take it seriously. So the silly example I like to use in class commonly, and think of your own, please, right, is eating an ice cream cone. Because what happens when you finish the ice cream? You're suffering. Might not be profound, I think, for most of us, right? Unless you have some dramatic dietary restriction, think that it's probably worth it to eat ice cream every once in a while, right? I mean, we only live once, maybe. We'll talk about that, right? But the pleasure is really nice. I mean, look, ice cream's great, especially in 2025. People make great ice cream. Ben and Jerry's was recently in the news. Maybe for not the best reasons, but without editorializing, right? The point is people like ice cream, right? But the very pleasure, the judgment, right, that ice cream is good, which makes sense, right? Like sugar dairy that's flavored is delicious. Still brings with it the disappointment when it's not present. And I would argue, and I think this is inevitably true, though it takes some consideration, that it's not just the moment right after where you wish you had more. That's a moment of suffering. Maybe you distract yourself. But this comes up again because the next day, when you feel like you shouldn't get ice cream, there's a kind of the remnant expectation. My life could be better if I was just eating ice cream again, but I shouldn't have it every day. Or I don't happen to be in a place that has ice cream, or they don't have the flavor I want, right? And then it's time for your proverbial broccoli or whatever it might be, right? And you say, well, all right, this is nourishing food, let's say, but it doesn't taste as good as ice cream, right? Because of the inherent judgment. By the way, I assume none of us actually thinks this out loud. It's be a little bit embarrassing. If at this stage of life that we're all in, we think, man, too bad this broccoli is an ice cream, right? And then we start to cry like my 7-year-old might, although she's pretty actually sophisticated in fairness. But in any event, you can imagine this, right? It doesn't have to be so explicit, but subtly we have already, and this is language we need, planted the seed of expectation of pleasure. So a slightly more profound example of this would be friendships. No one is saying that people shouldn't be friends. In fact, you could argue that some of the vows that Buddhist monks and nuns take to create communities of what's called sangha, communities of supporting fellow practitioners, are forms of something like spiritual friendship. Even the term for a teacher in one of the terms for teacher in Sanskrit and then later in Tibetan is a spiritual friend. But you have to admit, with friendships, moments of connection are often followed by moments of boredom or lack of connection. People change. Friendships change. Relationships change. And I'm not saying this to preach. You all know this to be the case. But notice, and please think of real examples here. You don't have to share them with everyone. Of like the slight disappointment when you were excited to see a friend, and either you got into a fight or your interests have changed. But it doesn't have to be so dramatic. It might just be, oh yeah, that dinner together, that walk together, that weekend together, that phone call wasn't as satisfying as I hoped. Is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with our relationship? Did we lose the magic? Did we lose the connection? Right? All these kind of neurotic thoughts that human beings often have, unless it's just me, but I doubt it is. Right? In a way, our response, not only to change, but also to the expectations that we build by judging things to be meaningful or good in the first place. So the reality is we can't always be doing the things we like. We can't always be eating ice cream, but also our experience of the eating the ice cream or the friendship itself is constantly going to be shifting. And to come back to the food example, but then you can apply this to friendship or otherwise. By the way, romantic relationships, of course, fit this bill. And without kind of poking the bear here too much, I bet spiritual experiences function the same way for many folks here as well, right? Prayer means something in some moments, and even like peak experiences of connection or feeling of universal compassion or the divine hearing you or a connection with Jesus or any other form of the divine. Again, I don't mean to project. I'm sure people have had remarkable experiences here, right? But the question is, does that very kind of evaluation of certain experiences as profound and meaningful, spiritual, divine, or otherwise, even moments of grace, influence in some way moments when they're absent? No one is saying they're not worthwhile, right? We're not making that judgment. We're just trying to be honest about the pervasiveness of suffering. That's the pitch so far. So to come back to the ice cream to make things a little bit worse, right? What happens if you just cave in? You say, well, look, I'm a good human being. I had a great day. I helped some people out. I stayed up late to listen to this Buddhism video, whatever else it might be, right? Good for us. We deserve ice cream. Great. So you have some ice cream. And you say, you know what? I want some more. I'm having some more. I deserve it, right? Which we all do. You have another one. What happens by the time you're on your third ice cream cone? I mean, it doesn't taste too good. I bet even visualizing eating 3 ice cream cones in a row, or 4, or 5, even those little hootsies that the kids used to have, it probably makes you sick even thinking about it. Think about how strange that is. The ice cream has not changed, right? You've diligently put it back in the fridge each time, or at the ice cream shop, they have it in the same bin. It's the same delicious, special flavored Ben and Jerry's or otherwise. Is that clear? Like the chemical compound, if you're a scientist, is exactly the same in the ice cream. Nothing has changed. So why is it delicious one moment and then the last thing you'd ever want to see after 4 cones, 5 cones, 6 cones? Well, someone here could probably explain the biology to us. But even without all the technicality, it's basically because we've changed quickly, right? Even in 5 minutes of consuming food, you change totally, right? Even the taste is going to shift in some sense, right? Your taste buds aren't going to respond the same way. They're not going to send the same signals to your brain. However it works, I don't know. But we all have had this experience, right? Same thing. You watch your favorite movie, watch it twice, 3 times. Oh, there's so much in the Kubrick film, or like whatever your favorite film is, right? And I can keep on finding new things, but at some point you just get bored, or it's less exciting, right? Or it's less dramatic. And that's just going to be disappointing. Not because the film has changed, but you've changed. And this is constantly happening, which leads into the third category here, which really points to, and I hate to tell you, it's pretty unpleasant to take seriously, the instability of us. So the technical term of this is the suffering of conditions. There are different ways and different interpretations of 2,500 years to explain what this means. But the short story is this is calling attention to our own change in a dependent world and the changes that our own activities bring when we're trying to respond to change. All right, what on earth am I talking about? Well, if you think about it, even just physically, materially, your body is constantly shifting, constantly, right? your brain's responses, your level of awareness, your sense of tiredness, your response to the environment around you, the heat, the cold, your ideas, your learning once we start thinking about mental experiences. In a way, this is wonderful that human beings have the capacity for change. Otherwise, things would be quite dull and we would have been long ago extinct, right? But still, the very fact of us on every level, and we will argue about this in a few weeks, is changing. Even for the folks who want to hold for some eternal, unchanging soul, we can argue about that in a few weeks. Buddhists are going to at least have some complaints about that theory. Okay. But for the most part, the vast majority of our experience is entirely dependent on things around us that are changing, and we respond in return. So we are dependent on some kind of shelter from the weather. We are dependent on water, on food, on other human beings to help us understand who we are and make us feel safe and all the things. And each of those, as we've already talked about, whether we judge them to be good or bad, are changing. And as we thought about in the examples of what? Ice cream, friendship, we're always shifting. And I don't mean like every 3 weeks, right? Or like, midlife crisis, a shift. We're saying it every moment, even perceptually, just look around. The perceptions you're having, the auditory stimulation of me talking, if you're still listening to me yap away, is constantly shifting. Look, I won't stop talking and the words keep on changing, right? Your feelings about the Zoom, right? Your attention. I mean, these things are constantly shifting. Okay, so this is a huge pitch that demands some kind of careful investigation, obviously. Me saying or pointing out the fact that we're depending on changing things and we're constantly shifting doesn't mean much unless we discipline ourselves to actually look, which no one is obligated to do here. But I'm just acknowledging that this relatively simple statement is pretty complicated, right? And it takes some investigation to see in action. But I think you'd find it's almost undeniable that we're just living in a world of constant shifts and uncertainty. And in fact, there's a feeling here that some modern Buddhist writers will talk about, which is just that basic sense of instability, right? Like the sense one famous teacher says that the other shoe is about to drop, that even if you've taken care of the things you need to take care of, you're forgetting something. And really, what the Buddha is saying, you are forgetting something, which is that you're forgetting to wake up to how things really are. But we'll get there, right? But this feeling that we can never quite be settled. And by the way, it's not because there's something wrong with us. It's rather because there's something right with us. We are dependent and shifting in body, in mind, in the conditions surrounding us. And wait, it's a little bit worse, which is what all next week is about, is that we respond in turn and change our own conditions. So you go get a job, or you make a new friend, or you apologize to someone, or you change your diet. Normal responses to a world of change bring about the conditions for more suffering. So here, I don't want to lecture you about this, but please try to think of an example from the last 24 hours where you tried to respond to the obvious reality of either instability, big or small. Like, I'm unstable because I don't know when the subway's coming in New York City, right? So I have to leave early. So I respond by leaving 5 minutes early or whatever it might be, right? Or responses to more dramatic changes, whatever it might be. Those actions establish the conditions for future suffering too, even if they're successful. And here, I can't give a long lecture about this at the moment because I want to get to questions in a few minutes. But this is a huge, huge issue. The very actions that we take in our body and also in our mind and in the things we say themselves keep the ball rolling. And this isn't the wonderful spinning of the wheel. This is the cycle of our own suffering. So we're going to talk about why that's the case. This all fits into this confusing category of the suffering of conditioned things. Hopefully, I've done a decent job so far before adding to the last piece, or at least previewing it, of scaring us a little bit. I know none of this is exactly news to us, but if you're anything like me or any other human being I've ever met, we spend a lot of our time ignoring how prevalent the things are that we judge to be negative, pretending there'll be a moment where we've escaped from them, right? Ignoring the negative consequences of grasping towards or becoming attached or even judging things that we like to be good, even if they are legitimately good, and recognizing how that sets us up for future suffering. And also, and this is the big one, ignoring the fundamental instability of being a being with a body and a mind who does stuff. These are all suffering. Yikes. And in 4 minutes, I'm going to tell you how we even, believe it or not, make things worse. All right, so I'm just going to quickly look here in the chat. I'm not sure if I'm seeing them all. Yeah, good. I have some great examples here. I appreciate it. Some heavy ones as well. All right, so let's do another couple minutes here before we actually start to talk to each other. And again, I appreciate your patience. What's the pitch? And again, not to worry, I promise we'll spend plenty of time on this in the coming weeks. But the pitch is that actually the moment that we judge something to be positive, negative, or neutral, not worth our time, we immediately respond to those things. How? If you see ice cream, you want ice cream. If you see a person or friend, you want to have some kind of connection to them. If you already have it, you already have the ice cream or the nice new car or the academic position or the friendship or whatever it might be, the closeness to God, you become attached to it, right? You establish value or you project value onto that thing. And then you don't want someone to take it away from you, right? Think about how profound this is. I mean, every, popular song and romantic comedy film is about this, right? Attachment and desire and the fear of loss, but obviously more serious phenomenon. Not that pop music isn't serious, but you get the idea, right? Both little things to huge things, right? Seemingly mundane to massive, right? Examples of positive judgment lead to desire and attachment. And what's the point here? We don't even notice how quickly. Why? Because we just judge the ice cream to be good, so of course you want it. Now, you might want it and be disciplined, you think. Is that clear? But already there's a little bit of a fight there. You're fighting with yourself. You're separating yourself from your own needs, wants, etc. And then there's this kind of tension involved. This is pretty normal. I'm sure we've all had this feeling, right? If we have dessert in the freezer, right? So in any event, what's the point, right? The point is the desire, the attachment comes immediately upon recognizing something is good, right? And by the way, having that experience, but then resisting, that's not sufficient in this story. We'll talk about this. Okay, this isn't about recognizing sin and then like swearing it off, which I'm not trying to dismiss as a powerful path in life. It just doesn't happen to be this path. It does not happen to be this path. Okay. But also when, as we all know, you recognize something bad, even if you're justified in doing so. And of course, we're not going to talk politics on this video, but everyone's constantly thinking that they are justified in their aversion to, their wish or desire to push away political outcomes they don't like, and then anger and hatred at people who are present in your life and you wish they weren't present in your life because of their political values or their political ideals. And by the way, this isn't about one position. This speaks to the entire kind of American political program at the moment. And I'm sure if people are international, this is relevant to politics wherever you are. The very recognition that something is bad or a human being is bad, even a human behavior is bad, is going to be about the desire to push things away, right? And then the last one has to do with, right, ignorance, which is to say, our very lack of recognition of the instability we were talking about, which includes the instability of our minds and our bodies, and the instability that our very actions, even the good ones, bring about, right, is a form or leads to worse suffering. It's like we pretend like we're just not going to pay attention to it. If I don't look at it, it's going to work out fine. If I can just get through this day, it'll disappear. But as we'll see next week with karma, nothing disappears. So, in each of these cases, our instinctive responses, and this is so important for the presentation, I hope you feel this way. I'll try to prove it to you in coming weeks, that these responses are built on our instinctive judgments that we don't even realize we're making. And then we make things worse. So you might want to think about whether, in fact, you make things worse by going get the ice cream or trying to set up a date with a friend or whatever it might be. But the argument is, in fact, because things are changing and bad things arise, desire and attachment just don't work. We can't always get the stuff that we really want. We even might say the stuff that we need, right? And we lose the things we're attached to, right? And things that we don't want, that we want to push away, keep on reemerging. And in fact, our anger, as we all know, makes things worse. Again, maybe it's justified. Righteous anger maybe has a place. People love to argue about this. But your experience is going to be of what? More suffering. And we all know this. If you are a righteously indignant human being, which I'm sure at moments every single one of us is, No insult intended. You're speaking with myself, but we're all human beings, right? So the idea is that aversion is going to hurt things, and ignorance ultimately, we'll have to prove this next week, is going to hurt things as well. So why on earth is this good news? This is the last comment. Why is this good news? Because we can learn to see the world differently, stop judging things in the same way that we're used to, and therefore stop responding. The end of suffering is the end of desire, clinging, attachment, aversion, anger, and ignorance. Is this possible? You're asking me as the college professor. Beats academy. But people have been talking about the possibility of this ending for at least 2,500 years. And according to Buddhist stories, the story is much older. And many people claim to have been successful. And at the very least, I think there's evidence that on the margins, people have really transformed their lives through changing their relationship to desire, aversion, hatred, jealousy, pride, and the like. All right, so I'm asking you, inviting you now for the coming weeks to take seriously this possibility, both that the problem is so much worse than we recognized, and yet that's good news because there's something we can do about it. And again, the we doesn't have to be everyone on the Zoom. I'm not asking you to become Buddhist. That's absolutely not the point of the course, of course, right? But I would like us to kind of try on for size some of these ideas as kind of a respectful way of taking seriously the proposals in the tradition. If we don't try them on for size, in a sense, I hope you understand what I mean by that. It's going to be really hard for us to take them as seriously as I think the ideas deserve. So that's plenty for my presentation. I really appreciate your patience through an hour of my talking, and I would love to chat in the remaining 10, 15 minutes with anyone who would like to speak up and jump in. Thank you again.
Matthew, I think you're going to start people's videos and unmute them so that people can begin a conversation. By the way, Joshua, I can see why you were an award-winning teacher. This was
Thank you for saying
great.
so.
And I was sitting here truly engaged. And I'm the person who put in that question about Stoicism, because I mean, I think the Stoics say the same thing. It's not, it's how you respond to the reality that is basically the problem. The problem is not the problem. It's how you respond to the problem. And it gave me a lot of pause tonight as you were talking. The Sisters of St. Joseph who sponsor this program, like other religious congregations, we are at a real important junction point where we're getting older. We don't have what we call vocations. And so this lack of vocations, this not seeing people coming behind us, is creating a lot of angst in people. And I can see that how you respond to this situation is something that, I mean, there are diverse responses to it. And some people, it's an anxiety producing experience. For other people, it's not so much an anxiety. It's the apathy in the Stoic term of not having great feelings about it. So I think there's a lot in our human lives, in our religious life, just in human life in general, where you can see the response. One person gets cut off in traffic in the morning and goes berserko. Sometimes I do that, and then sometimes I say, okay, go, who really cares? And that's a better morning. Right? Anyway,
Certainly is.
yeah. Jonathan?
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Matthew, are we seeing everybody on the screen now, the gallery view? Yeah. So, Matthew, I think people's cameras and their audio is still off. Would you like to put them on? Jean Burns, you're raising your hand. Do you have a question or a comment? No. Okay. Matthew is going to bring you on. And if you want to have a comment or a question, you can go down and find the icon so you can raise your hand. And if you can't find the icon, just wave and we can kind of see you and acknowledge you. And welcome, everyone. It's nice to see all the participants. And if you have a friend, can I make this little announcement? if you have a friend who signed up for this course and they didn't get a link tonight, I'm finding out through text messages that there was some problem in sending out the links tonight, and some people who had registered for the course didn't get them. So if you know someone and that's the case, could you tell them I apologize, and we'll take care of getting this right for next week. Anybody have any comments or questions? Or this was a lot to absorb tonight in a good sense, Joshua. Unbelievable.
Gonna get worse, I think. That we're gonna have a lot to absorb, but I appreciate it. Just quickly to say how nice it is to see real human beings out there. It's nice to meet you all.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Anyone at all? Is it? Yeah, I think there's something down in the chat for you.
I will be happy to label the artwork. We may not use art every week, but I can go back and label the ones we saw so you can go take a peek as well. The nice thing about these images, I tend to use ones that you can actually access. So what I might also do is share with Matthew or others like resources, some readings perhaps some weeks and videos, and certainly links to art if you want to take the deep dive. But I'll do my best to get there. Thanks for suggesting it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Don't be shy.
I guess I'll say hello.
Hi, Barbara. How are you?
Hi. Thank you. It was a very interesting lecture. So I guess my question would be, is it just using the techniques of Buddhism, or are we going to learn how, I understand we're going to learn about Buddhism, but how we use this in our lives to handle stress?
So yeah, so there are a couple of ways to answer. And if there's a second part, please continue, but I'm happy to respond to that, Barbara.
I've been listening to a lot of Buddhist tapes and recordings, so I'm familiar with it, but I was just wondering if this is not necessarily a Buddhist teaching, I guess I would say.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the question. There's a lot potentially to say here. I would say like the most boring answer is in the coming 4 sessions, I want to lay out as an ambitious a vision of what early Buddhist communities thought the problem was and how to deal with it, because they undergird all sorts of different strategies, as I mentioned, for 2,500 years. Now, some of the pieces of what I'll lay out will be familiar to folks through the way that they are translated into contemporary. The most common way of thinking about this would be mindfulness instructions, although that's not the only strategy. And I see all the heads because people are quite familiar. So some of the elements of the story are going to make it. You'll see when we talk about monasticism, becoming a monk or a nun, which is a huge piece historically Buddhist tradition, a lot of that has been not rejected, but ignored in the adaptation of certain forms of Buddhism in the United States and elsewhere around the world. There are Buddhist monastics in the United States, but for social reasons, it's a lot harder to support a monastery than it used to be. So you start to see things like meditation apps, meditation centers, weekend retreats, and this is a long, really interesting story, the merging of meditation practice, awareness practice, and what we might call American therapeutic culture, where meditation becomes not so much a lifelong path as an extracurricular activity for the marginal increase of our satisfaction. And by the way, I know that sounds dismissive. I don't mean it that way, right? We're just being honest about how it fits in people's lives. And it's not a value judgment, because I think a lot of people would argue rightfully that there's been an incredible contribution of some Buddhist ideas and practices to people's marginal happiness as a form of extracurricular activity or passion or hobby, whatever you want to call it, right? In a son of a therapeutic vein, making people more satisfied or happier, even more aware and involved in their relationships. So, but it's a really specific kind of slice and strategy, even in the United States when there's many different kinds of Buddhism. It's a really specific slice. So I'm not going to do the history of that, because I don't think that's what's called for now. Maybe at the end of the spring, if we get through a bunch of stuff, because there's a lot of hidden material in a mindfulness instruction that you may not realize is there. So maybe we can attend to that at the end of like the spring if we get that far, but that's not the intention of this discussion. But I know that's boring because who cares? That's arbitrary what I happen to be doing. The question is really wonderful. So if we want to like piece together or let's say drop in a few of these kinds of questions as they come up, Barbara or anyone else, please do. I wouldn't be offended.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's a helpful or a satisfying answer, but at least that's a start.
Joshua, did I hear you correctly at the beginning, where you said that
Mm.
in the very beginning, the Buddha looked at um, people who were practicing self-abnegation and asceticism and said, that's really not the way to go. Did you say that? But,
Yeah. So yeah, please.
yeah, but so the question is, so, but in the life of Buddhist monks and nuns, isn't there currently self-abnegating practices? Like I mentioned to you last night when we spoke, I worked with Carmelec Somo, a Buddhist nun, and if I remember correctly, she fasted all day long from breakfast until supper. I mean, that's a form of self-sacrifice, self-abnegation kind of things that Christians do sometimes. So, has self-abnegation and sacrificial living crept back into
Yeah.
Buddhist monastic practice?
Yeah, and it did really very early. So thank you, Sister Maria. Great question.
It did.
So asceticism has long been a part of the monastic practice to some extent. And then, especially like, for example, in China, there are these stories of like extreme ascetics, which none of that's never popular. I'm sure in the Christian tradition, it's the same thing. Even when you have a very rich tradition of asceticism, it doesn't mean that many people did it because it's hard. But the tradition is well known and you have famous meditators, etc. So yeah, there are more extreme versions. I would argue that I don't know if monastic rules themselves are follow the logic of self-abnegation in the way that the Buddha was criticizing. Because the point there was that you can't just deny the things that we like as a solution. So if one was to say, look, desire causes suffering, right? And I always joke because I have college students. So they say like it's a little bit different than it used to be. But they say like, well, like if you're a 20-year-old and someone teaches you in class, a philosophy class, that desire, right, for changing things is going to cause you to suffer, then you say, fine, I don't want anything anymore. I'm a nihilist, right? I mean, I don't know. It's like when in college. That's what it's like when I was in college. I don't believe in anything. Who cares? It's just going to make me miserable. I quit. But of course, excuse the, the direct language, but that's BS. Nobody who says they're a nihilist in college, I'm not saying kind of some philosophically rich tradition, nobody's really a nihilist. They're attached to their own identity as somebody who's quitting things. Is that clear? And so they're generating a certain kind of form of pleasure through imagining themselves to be a certain way, which has nothing to do with anything. So in a way, this is part of the criticism, which is that this is slippery and tricky, which is why you have to have a path. But the very attachment to the path itself is a form of suffering. It's inevitable. If you're not attached to your own monastic practice, you're not going to become a monk or a nun. But at some point, that attachment gets in the way. And in a way, you could interpret the kind of criticism, it's called the middle way teaching, where you say it's not going to be successful if you just desire, get as much stuff as you want, which, by the way, is pretty much everybody's strategy in the United States, maybe excepting a couple folks here on the Zoom, right? But that's that's a basic strategy. Get all the good stuff, right? But also just quitting all the bad or good stuff that's not a solution. Why? Because we need, and we'll try to explain this in a way that's not too abstract next week, right? Not that you're not smart enough, but I want us to really worry about it, is like how deep perceptually our problem is. And that's why you need knowledge. Quitting isn't sufficient. Is that clear? It's transforming how we see things so that we won't be filled with desire. So that's more of a sneak preview than an answer. But yeah, Sister Marie, you're absolutely right. To say that there's no asceticism in the Buddhist tradition is like a bad joke.
I think we have time for one more question or comment. Anybody else? Don't be shy. Okay, then we'll leave it at that. And I think you'll agree with me that the presentation we had tonight was really packed and well presented, engaging. Everybody is awake not awake the way you mean it, but awake.
Maybe that too. You never
And
know.
hopefully by the end of this class, we may all be awake in the way you mean it. So good night, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. See you all next Thursday night. Thanks,
Thank you,
Joshua.
So nice to meet you all. See
Thank
you in a
you.
week.
Nice
Good
to
night,
meet you.
everybody.